Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. My name is Melanie McNair. I am the Senior Director of Public Programming here, and I'm happy that you've all joined us. How many of you are visiting the Center for Fiction for the first time tonight? Absolutely no one. So I will save you the usual song and dance and just point out a couple of things that we're excited about. One is the fabulous photographer of authors, Beowulf Sheehan, has a little exhibit here of portraits of Cormac McCarthy. If you want to take a look at those, there's a closing reception for that on December 13th. More importantly, well, I don't know, I wouldn't say that. Beowulf, if you're listening, you're very important. Also very exciting, I should say, is tickets are now on sale for our first Novel Fete, which is the best literary party of the year, and that is on December 2nd. So check it out. There'll be a reading by the 7 finalists from the first novel prize this year, but then also like the whole building is open. There's like an open bar and food and tarot card readers, and it's just a great time for people who love reading and who love books, which don't always go together, but usually do. Um, for Let's see, I want to say a special thank you to Jisoo Kim from the Feminist Press for her collaboration and for the idea for this panel. And one housekeeping announcement is that we will have an audience Q&A this evening. And to ask a question, please raise your hand and one of our fabulous interns will bring the microphone to you so that you can be heard by the people who are watching on the live stream as well. And hello to all of you. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat at any time. All right, let me welcome our panelists here. We have YZ Chen, the author of Edge Case, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and Though I Get Home, winner of the Louise Merriweather First Book Prize. She is also the translator of The Age of Goodbyes by Li Zixu. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Guernica, Gulf Coast, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. Emma Ramadan is an educator and literary translator from French. She is the recipient of the PEN Translation Prize, the Albertine Prize, an NEA Fellowship, and a Fulbright. Her translations include so sorry, I should have read these names first. A Country for Dying and Pretty Things and Panics. David Unger, Guatemalan-born, received his country's Miguel Angel Asturias National Literature Prize for Lifetime Achievement in 2014, and he writes exclusively in English and lives here in the U.S. The Mastermind, his latest novel, has been translated into 9 languages. This year, Penguin Classics published his retranslation of Guatemalan literature novelist Miguel Angel Asturias, Mr. President, with a new introduction to glowing reviews. And our moderator for this evening is Madhu Kaza, born in Andhra Pradesh, India. Madhu is a writer, translator, artist, and educator based in New York City. She works as assistant dean of the Bard microcolleges at Bard Prison Initiative and teaches in the MFA program at Columbia University. Please welcome them all to the stage.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I like this like cafe style seating arrangement. Before we start, I just was curious. It's not pitch dark out there, but I'm just curious if you could just raise your hand if you yourself are a translator. Great. We've got some translators in the crowd. Yay, great. So the topic of today's conversation with these wonderful translators is on the politics and translation. And it's such a huge topic, and I feel like we could approach it. I feel like I could ask basically any question, and if from any angle, and we'd find ourselves maybe at some point at some crossroads of thinking about politics. And so, we'll have we'll probably kind of cut across different kinds of issues along the way. But I guess one of the things I thought maybe we'd start with, just because each of us probably started in literary translation, not because of some big cultural ideas or even political ideas, but through a love of literature, right? And often through an aesthetic kind of attraction. But of course, we also bump up against issues of politics and advocacy along the way. So I was wondering if maybe we could start by each of you talking a little bit about how you found your way into translation, and or as a moment when you, like, maybe an early moment, but it could also be more recent, where you kind of, as a translator, kind of just bumped up against something that made you think about the politics of translation. So maybe we'll start with YZ.
Sure. So I never really thought about being a translator until pretty right before I started on the project of translating The Age of Goodbyes. And that was from a conversation with a writer and translator I really admire. His name is Jeremy Tiang. I know you had a talk with him right here in the Center for Fiction. And just by conversations with him, I slowly sort of came to, this will sound, kind of arrogant, but sort of like embodying translation in a way, like I am translation. Just because growing up in multicultural Malaysia, it's very common and natural for Malaysians to like sort of slip and swim between different languages and dialects. In fact, there are many jokes that are sort of predicated on homonyms across languages. And so, rather than thinking of a translator as someone who goes to school and studies a specific language for years and years, I thought I would be a good fit for this particular translation project, which is a novel called The Age of Goodbyes by Li Zishu, a renowned Malaysian writer working in Chinese, because she wrote about her hometown, which is an hour's drive from where I grew up, my hometown. And so the setting, the idiosyncrasies of the book, of the language, of the setting was very familiar to me. And in fact, Zishu herself, isn't shy to talk about how she didn't go to college. She's sort of like quote unquote self-taught. And in that way, I felt like I was one of the best possible people who could be a translator for her book. And so that's how I got into translation. And I feel like this sort of familiarity with the context and the sort of maybe slight overlap in her writing background and my translation background means I can approach the translation project as more of a creative writing project because it's not, I don't start from theory. Just like her, I start from like she's sort of paying homage to pieces of her childhood, but in an artful, elevated way. And I find that that's like an entry for me as a translator. And that's not to say I will never translate anything that doesn't have overlap with my biographical details. That's silly. But I just feel like in this case, it is a way for me to see this my very first translation project as creative writing.
Sorry, excuse my voice. I was in college when I first started to think about translation as a thing that I could do, and I think I was studying comp lit and I was writing essays about books and I was reading books and I knew I loved books and it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just read them and to talk about them and to write about them. It just wasn't enough. And so someone at my college told me that there was a workshop that I could take where you could translate the literature. And as someone who had been studying French in school, and also in my family, people speak French, I had already this affinity for certain writers in French that I wanted to kind of learn more about through this process of translation. And then it became this, I think, thing for me where it wasn't just that I was learning about these authors in different ways through translation, but it also became a really personal, kind of selfish act where I was learning about myself through translating, and that was a really special, cool thing. So I just kept doing it. And not every book is gonna like open your eyes to something about yourself, and you know, sometimes you translate things for different reasons, but it's been an evolving process for me since then. And in terms of the politics, I think something I butt up against a lot, and this might be sort of taking your question in a certain angle that we don't have to go down, but I think where I most encounter it is in pitching projects and the politics of the literary landscape here and what people want to read, or what people want you to pitch from certain places of the world, and the kind of refrain of when I pitch writers from a certain part of the world where there's not a lot of translated literature here, then I get this, oh, we already have, you know, an Arab writer on our list for this year, so like pass, you know, things like that, as if all Arab writers were the same, or as if all Moroccan writers were the same, or as if all Iranian writers were the same, and that if you have too many of them on your list, somehow that's a bad thing. And so that's sort of where I most often encounter these political questions.
Good. Can you hear us? Okay, good, great. So I was born in Guatemala and was sort of forcefully brought to this country and didn't want to be here. I was about 4.5 years old, and I just had a very difficult time adjusting to the Anglo-Saxon world, and sort of navigated two languages, you know, pretty much through my childhood and adolescence. And but I was sort of illiterate in Spanish because I could speak Spanish, but I couldn't actually read it at the age of 16 and 17. And when I went to college, I sort of said, well, this is the moment when I have to start connecting the spoken language with the written language, even reading newspapers. And I sort of taught myself to read Spanish and look at Spanish words that didn't seem to make sense with the words that I was pronouncing. But I think when I went to Columbia University, I was in the MFA program, and I was a very, very serious poet. I would say sort of like a silk scarf, whiskey breath poet. And I met other people. This was sort of in the 70s, and I asked, well, who can I translate? And the person who was leading the MFA program at Columbia said, well, you should be translating these Chilean poets that aren't really that well known. So I just started translating poetry. I did a couple of books for New Directions, and I continued writing poetry. And I mostly worked with small presses. I don't know if you would consider New Directions a small press nowadays because of their recent successes with Bolaño and other writers. And then I published translations of 3 women writers from Mexico with a press that doesn't exist anymore called Curbstone Press. And Curbstone was a press that was politically engaged, completely and politically engaged, and generally published the work of radical Central American writers. So I basically had a home for the books that I was translating. And I would say that up until like a couple of years ago, I'd never really worked with a major press. And I did a book for Penguin Random House called Folk Tales for Fearless Girls. It's a title that I hated because the Spanish title was Cuentos que nunca nos contaron, which I thought was more poetic, which is stories we were never told, which is about folk tales about female heroines or heroes. I thought the English title felt sort of exclusive. If I were a young boy, I don't know if I would read a book called Folk Tales for Fearless Girls. It's sort of, but that was a marketing tool. So I sort of encountered politics with that book. I tried arguing with the editor about the title, because the title was just, to me, much more suggestive and neutral and friendly. And I felt that this was like a corporate decision. There's a whole series of books that have stories and poems about fearless girls, so this is fitting into that, even though the stories really were quite diverse.
I want to say one thing just about the politics of this panel, which is just to say that if there's something you want to say, just take whatever I ask, go in whatever direction you want to go in. Like that's.
Thank you.
We can do that. But I actually want to just follow up and say that in some ways, I have a similar story of being brought against my will at a similar age and having a lot of trauma associated with that. But my schooling, the language I studied from second grade through college was French. And I've said it before, and I say it obviously like facetiously, but to me French, apologies Emma, is like a useless language. But because of this particular issue, right? But it's the language that I was really, like if I was trained to eventually translate, that would be the language, you know? And so in fact, for me, it is already just a huge political thing. I didn't set out thinking of it this way, but it's a huge thing for me to say. And you know, I have done a little bit of Spanish translation, I find that in some ways emotionally and otherwise in some ways Spanish is easier for me to translate from. Not because it's the work, translation is hard no matter what, but it's like it circulates in a particular way here, and it's not fraught, and but for me, like even just the very decision to say like I want to translate from Telugu, which is my first language, is so difficult because people here don't even know the language exists.
Or how to pronounce it.
How to pronounce it. They often confuse it with Tagalog, and to say that it's not a minor language, it's a literary language, it's one of the top spoken languages in the world, and to just make a case, just the fact that I want to do this work feels like a political choice. Again, I didn't set out, I wasn't like, I'm going to do something political. It was more an emotional choice, but I understand the stakes of how each of us come to this work with a kind of personal kind of, with some baggage or some particular interests. I want to follow up on something, Emma, that you said about maybe the space within even a particular language for, let's say, like, you know, for publisher, you mentioned pitching projects and a publisher saying maybe, well, we've got our Arab writer for the year, and if you think about Arab French writers, that's a lot of different people in a lot of different places, different cultural contexts. And I think within any language system, there are also the politics within that language. So you mentioned Central American as opposed to Argentine, Chilean, Spanish, different forms of French. I know, YZ, you mentioned that this book that you just translated is Malaysian writer as opposed to someone writing out of mainland China, for instance. Right. And that all of those things have their own politics. I'm wondering if any of you might want to speak to that. Like the politics within the language of what kinds of books you feel like there's a reception for, and maybe your own advocacy within the language.
Go for it.
Sure, yeah, I can go first. So, yeah, I think Sinophone literature in Malaysia is the writers in that school consider themselves pretty unique. They call themselves Mahua literature, which is like a condensed form of Malaysian Sinophone literature, and a lot of it has political contexts and backgrounds. Chinese people make up about 20% of Malaysian population, and from the Chinese society's perspective, they've had to sort of fight tooth and nail to incorporate Chinese as part of the education system, for whether it's like 1 hour a week in public schools, or whether it's like completely privately funded private schools that focus on Chinese teaching. The main goal is to keep the language alive, and that's why sort of the local writers see their writing, Mahua literature, as both sort of a minor literature, and also something that they're really proud of because it arises out of sort of tenacity and stubbornness, and a lot of organizing against what the main political forces might wish the situation to be. And at the same time, there's sort of this sort of delicate tightrope that a lot of Chinese people might find themselves walking in Malaysia, where the accusation is like, oh, if you cling on to your Chinese language, then you're not patriotic, and you don't love your country unless you abandon what makes you sort of other. And so the reaction, there's like sort of two extremes. One is, then someone sort of renounces everything Chinese about them and be like, I'm just Malaysian. Or the other extreme is sort of like, I'm going to send my kids to Chinese private school. Everything's going to be Chinese. We're going to keep the flame alive. And so that's sort of like the political landscape that some Mahua writers find themselves navigating. And I don't have my phone on me right now, but I find there's a very poignant quote from a Mahua writer called Ho Sok Fong, where she sort of says what's unique and special about Malaysian Sinophone literature and why it cannot be sort of judged and placed in the same boat as Sinophone literature from out of mainland China, is that Mahua literature absorbs and incorporates a lot of local sayings. It's all about hybridism. It's all about expanding the language even to the point of breaking down grammar, breaking down syntax, and where it breaks, like where the language has holes, that's where emotion comes through. And she's sort of making an appeal for Mahua literature to be judged as a minor literature, not against the standards of a major literature, as something from mainland China would be judged.
I think for me, so I only translate from French, and when I was in Morocco working on a translation project, I think I started to put the pieces into place of what it means that I translate from French, and also am interested in translating literature from places other than France. And part of the difficulty, even when I was in Morocco, where I had to go to actually be able to do the translation project I wanted to do, for the resources, for the knowledge, for the contact with the author's daughter, all of these things. But even when I was there, I was like, okay, I'm gonna get as much literature, I read as widely as I can, these different Moroccan writers writing in French, and so that when I'm done with this project, I will be able to continue pitching. And there's a problem of resources, and there's a problem of infrastructure. So there are very, very few bookstores in Morocco, and then at those bookstores, I still couldn't generally find a lot of literary books. And then among those works of literature, I also, a lot of them were in Arabic as opposed to French. But even in the libraries, there's like this one library in Rabat that's really kind of difficult to get to, and then it's very intimidating to go in. As even like for me, it was intimidating. So imagine who's actually going into that library in Morocco. And so there's this kind of ripple effect of there aren't a lot of publishing houses to begin with. There aren't a lot of bookstores selling those books. They're not circulating. If you're outside of Morocco, you can't necessarily have access to them. And even when I was there in Morocco trying so hard to get access to them, there were barriers. And so it's a lot easier when you translate from French to translate books that you get in France, or French authors. There's a lot more resources and grants from the French government. They're better advertised. There are more bookstores in France. The French publishers are going to Frankfurt or wherever book fairs. Like, Moroccan publishers are not going there, and Lebanese publishers are not going there, and are not in the same, to the same extent. And so there's like this thing that happens where when you translate from French, it just becomes easier to translate the books from France, and to translate the books where there's money, where there's resources, where there's infrastructure. And you have to like actively work against that. But also as a translator, how many resources do you have to then go to Morocco and spend time there and go to the library, and how do you, so it's like the whole system is working to get you to just translate books from France. And so working against that has been something I'm trying to do more and more of. And I'm losing track of where I was going with this, but I think using Morocco as the example, I remember. Using Morocco as the example is the easiest way for me to talk about it, because since I've left Morocco, I have continued to pitch Moroccan writers, and I have translated more books by Moroccan writers, but it's harder for me, for sure. It's harder than I expected it to be. The other thing that's happening is that I'm half Lebanese, and it was like this, I really wanted, when I started translating, to be able to translate Lebanese literature. It was so important to me. And it's really hard for me to find books from Lebanon written in French that I really connect to. And when I talk to my friends who are Lebanese or who are able to read Arabic, they're all like, oh, it's too bad you don't read Arabic, because all the good stuff's being written in Arabic, or in English. A lot of it's just being written in English. And this like thing that I thought I'd be able to do so easily, of like, oh, of course, well, I speak French and I translate, so if I'm going to translate tons of Lebanese writers. There are just all these impediments to being able to do that. And then when I actually did find that book, that this Lebanese writer that I really connected to and was so excited to start pitching, I was running into that same thing of, oh, we already have a writer from that part of the world on our list for this year, things like that. So just impediment after impediment, whereas when you're translating books from France, no one's saying that to you. No one's saying, oh, we already have a French writer on our list for this season. So I think, again, like being aware of how swept up in that system, how much people, or the literary systems just want you to translate writers from France, and then having to actively work against that at every stage. That's sort of how I'm conceptualizing it.
So I have a question for all of you, because talking about the politics of translation, I'd like to ask you questions about the financial aspect of translation, because that's really what the politics of translation comes down to, I think. So you're pitching books or pitching writers. Are you thinking that you're going to, I know you've gotten a couple of fellowships, NEA grants. Are you thinking that you're going to make a living out of your work as a translator, or are you getting a full-time job on the side? And who are you pitching to? And what do you, how much money are you I'm sorry, I'm sounding like the moderator, but I'm sort of, no, I believe you.
No, I mean, I think I'm laughing because I just took a full-time job for this reason. Because I love translation, I love translating. And it had become untenable for me to do the kind of translation work I wanted and also live. So I just took a full-time job thinking, oh, this is it. Like, this is the solution. I'll work this full-time job, and then on top of that, I'll just be able to focus on the translation work I really care about doing and do it really well. And of course, what's happened is like I don't have any time to translate because I have a full-time job. So it's like this endless push and pull of how do you do the translation work you want to do in the way that you want to do it, and also pay your bills. I don't know. I don't have the answer. Maybe someone else has the answer.
Sorry. I've only translated this one novel, but I will say it doesn't pay the bills. I'm also a writer, and my first two books were written when I did have corporate jobs, and then I left the workforce during COVID, as did many women, because my child needed my attention. There's like some medical scares. Anyway, long story short, yeah, it's definitely more of a passion project. For this project specifically, as I said earlier, it's set in and written by someone who grew up an hour away from me, and I just feel like my part of the world you don't see really that much in English books, and I wanted to add another book and be partially responsible for the existence of this book in English, that sort of features the vibrancy of where I grew up.
I'll add that I have made $0. Like zero, big $0 on translation. And the one book that I translated, co-translated, was published in India. So it's, it was not published in the U.S. And it was published in India, and I've done a few, smaller publications in the U.S. But so it's like a non-starter from the language that I'm working from. And I think what's amazing is that there's some really wonderful activity that's been happening amongst like translators, in terms of like advocacy for getting better rates for translators, getting recognition for translators, right? Like there's lots of really wonderful things happening around translation right now, and I think it's really important. I think it depends on what it also depends on like what you're translating, what language you're translating from. I mean, as Emma, as you're saying, it's like if you really like, I guess we all have to make a decision about like, I think some translators do some like, they get like, oh, there's some like the really big famous writer that everyone is talking about. We need a translation of this big work. You're going to get paid for that, and then you can use that and then subsidize your passion project or something. But I feel like some way or the other, we all have to like figure out a way to do this work. But I don't know, David, like throwing it back at you. Have you found a way to be full-time translating?
Well, I kind of have like two full-time jobs. I direct a publishing program at City College. I've done it for 20 years, trying to increase diversity in the publishing industry, and it's been a pretty successful program. But I don't have an academic position. I'm a staff worker there. And I also work with a book fair, the Guadalajara International Book Fair, which is the largest Spanish language book fair in the world. And we actually have like sort of little fellowships or support programs for up to 10 or 15 translators, offering them like three nights hotel and some food support. And a lot of translators go to Guadalajara to look for new writers. Frankfurt has a fellowship program. A lot of book fairs do have programs, and it's sort of a way to sort of like get out of this country and see the world and go. Like I just came from the Sharjah International Book Fair. Does anyone know where Sharjah is? Nobody. It's one of the smallest emirates in the United Arab Emirates, and it's sort of like the cultural capital of the Arab world. So they have this conference where they invite 900 publishers or editors and they pay their way there, and they pay for their table and their hotel to negotiate and sell rights. They also have a small translation program, and they fly everybody to the Middle East. And the Middle East is really quite an active area. Abu Dhabi also has a lot of activity. The Cairo Book Fair has like 2 million people going to it. I think you have to get out of this country a little bit. I never, I always had full-time jobs. I raised 2 kids of my own, and with my second wife, a third daughter. So I never had I've translated 16 books, but it's always been on my own time. It's hard. It's a translator like Edie Grossman, who translated a number of novels by Garcia Marquez and Mario Vargas Llosa. She had a lawyer as her agent, and he, was able to negotiate amazing contracts. But we're all here supposedly talking about a book that we've just translated, and so I think I can take a minute or two just to talk about the economics of it. So I retranslated a novel that was written in the 20s and 30s by Miguel Ángel Asturias. It wasn't published till 48 in Spanish, and then in 1962 a translation came out that was quite flawed. So I felt that, after 60 years, it's time to retranslate. I got a small grant from the New York State Council on the Arts because I thought I had the rights to translate the book, but the agency gave me the rights, even though the rights were not available. And then I published my translation with Penguin Classics like 5 years later. And I'm going to mention that I got $7,000 more, so I got paid $12,000 to translate a novel that off and on, I won't say I was working every day. There were many, many months during COVID where I wasn't doing anything on it. But, almost a good part of 5 years for $12,000. The economics just don't make sense.
Since I think we can agree the economics don't make sense, and on the one hand, there's like a lot of like advocacy work that can be done. There's also just like fundamental issues of money. There's also issues of imagination. So there's like the money piece, but there's also imagination. And I guess I want to think about like how I think we as translators are also then advocates for a particular writer, a particular language, a particular culture, and how like I think maybe just going to your recent translation of Panics, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because it seems like a real work of advocacy.
Sure. As I hack up along again. I just translated this book called Panics for Feminist Press, and it's really special. This is one of those books that like I translated it for the author's daughter and for people to be able to read it, but I also translated it very much for me. Really special, really, really special book. And basically I was translating this other project, this book of short nonfiction pieces by Marguerite Duras. I was reading through all of Duras's nonfiction work to find what we wanted to put in the book, and then I stumbled upon her preface to this book called Viens by Barbara Molinard, and the preface itself was like so bananas, and was like about this woman who would just write and write and write, and then immediately tear up everything she had written in these like neat piles on her desk, and but how Duras had felt that these stories were really special, and so she had like saved them from Barbara Molinard's enemy, as in herself, to go give them to a publishing house. And so exactly 14 of her stories were saved and published, and then that was it. And it was not successful when it came out in 1969 in France. It did go out of print pretty quickly, I think, and the rights reverted back to the daughter, daughters plural, and like that was it for many decades. And so like when I came upon this preface, I was like, I have to find this book. Where do I find this book? Couldn't find it anywhere. Knocked on the emailed the publisher, and they were like, we don't even have a PDF of this book. Go contact the daughter. The daughter was like, I don't have a PDF of this book. Let's talk. And then, long story short, I got it through interlibrary loan. I scanned the whole thing illegally, and then like started translating it, and met up with the daughter to get her permission in France. And again, like very lucky that I had the resources to go to France to talk to this woman, and it became this like obsession of mine, and I just think it's such a good book. But because I couldn't kind of back it up with, oh, it was this huge success in France, and oh, it's the hot thing, and it won this prize and that prize, and you know, it's like a very quiet book. It's about one woman's, well, my reading of it is it's like about her experience of being alive, and how difficult it really is to be alive, and especially when you feel sort of out of sync with the world around you, and it's not sexy. I mean, you know, I don't know. I don't think it's sexy, and it's not like one of those like books about war that's going to win a prize. You know, it is what it is. It's like a really beautiful thing, but it's not like it's not the kind of thing that when you pitch it, you know how to pitch it to get a publisher to say like, yes, absolutely, we must do this. And I mean, Feminist Press does such amazing translations. I mean, YZ's book also with Feminist Press, and Feminist Press, what's so special about them, not that this is like an ad for Feminist Press, but maybe it is, that they read books for what they are and not for how to market them or how to sell them. It's about the literature, and so Feminist Press has done a lot of books by women that were sort of like recovered or saved in this sense, and who knows, like maybe someone else would have come along and translated Panics, would have eventually found that preface in Duras's nonfiction work and like somehow gotten a copy of this book and then somehow gotten a publisher to do it, maybe. But I don't know that, it just like, who knows, maybe it wouldn't have ever been translated. And so this like amazing thing that can happen when you as a translator like go out and find something and then, you know, tooth and nail get it available again. And it's not just available now in English, but it's been reprinted. It was just republished in France in a new edition, which is so cool. And so the daughters get to see this book by their mother back in print again, which is
Is that as a result of your translation?
It's wonderful.
Bravo.
Talk about the afterlife of attacks,
it's
right?
crazy, yeah, and it's so special. And but it is like, it was a fight. I mean, same thing. Like, I was paid a certain amount for the book. I was pitching, and I did the sample, and I was pitching that book for years before. And then when I got the contract, it was another year or so of translating it, and the economics don't add up. But like, I'm so happy to have done it and to have advocated for that book and to advocate for books like that, you know, have sort of like disappeared into oblivion, and someone has to come and like physically take them out of oblivion. And I think that's like a big part of what a lot of translators do. And yeah.
I mean, I think in that respect, it's something that we talked about earlier, is the way in which, in that sense, like, so translators are cultural agents, right? Like, there's a way in which you get to do this thing where you get to move. It doesn't always work in the way that you might want, because it is often like a kind of battle, but there is something about moving the needle a little bit. And something that I read in your afterword to Panics had to do with like feeling like this doesn't exist in English. And so it's like wanting to enrich not only your own self, but enrich what's possible in English, like, in fact, it is an enrichment of English literature, right, to do translation. And I feel like, I'm sure David or YZ, like, you've had this experience of like, we need this here, right? I don't know if either of you want to speak to that part of like the advocacy of like really feeling like something is not, something like there's something that's I'm missing in the sense that I feel like a solidarity that's part of doing translation work that's about saying, like, there's something that, or let me put it really, really plainly, which is that I had a conversation with a friend, and it was like a horror story. And the horror story was, what if we didn't have any literature in translation and we were stuck with what's called English literature? And I was like, oh my God, the horror, the horror. As much as I love, I mean, there's like great work, right? But I was really stricken by that. Like, it was really, in terms of like how we are formed by all these other things that, that exist. And maybe that's part of the impulse also.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I'm not a translator by training, but in the process of translating The Age of Goodbyes, as to my best knowledge, and please anyone correct me if I'm wrong, including people on the live stream, but I believe The Age of Goodbyes is only the second ever novel by a Malaysian Sinophone writer to be translated into English, but that's not what's special about it for me. I think what's special is just like how bold and how accurate the book feels to me as a Malaysian Chinese person. So it's like you would call it an experimental book. The book starts on page 513. There's like 3 at first seemingly unrelated plot strands that are like interwoven, and at the very start you're told that the book has something to do with the May 13, 1969 race riots in Malaysia. But then very quickly the book sort of is like consumed by the lives of this, woman called Tulian and like this character called Yu, like second person. Anyway, it's like if you were to pick up the book wanting to learn like facts about the May 13th race riot, you'd probably come away pretty disappointed. But I think that's what is so powerful for me about the book, because like if you wanted to learn facts about a race riot, you would go read a nonfiction book. For me, the power of this novel and fiction in general is like it attempts to capture what it feels like to live during that period, not just like at this time in the afternoon who did what, like how many people died, but it's like the just like pervasive feeling of like doom and gloom and the like desire to thrive despite all of that. So what's powerful about this novel is it's almost like it represents for me, this is my read of the novel, like a wish fulfillment. Sorry about that. Where, because there's like government censorship, authorities like they like clamp down on what really happened on May 13th. No one really knows the facts. Like we don't even know for sure what the casualties, like how many people died. And so in the book, one of the 3 plot strands is the character named Yu is sort of trying to find out where he's from, his lineage, who his mother is, who his father is. And the book does provide the answers. And for me, and I think for a lot of other Malaysian people, that's the ultimate fantasy, that you can read a book and find out what really happened, what is your history, what is your background. And so that's, and it's a very moody book in a way, parts of it very moody. And all of this like sort of combines to make like very irresistible texture for me, and I feel like that's the kind of books I want in translation, fiction books I want in translation. Not sort of like tour guide fiction where it's like someone thinks, oh, maybe it's an easier way to learn about history. I just read a fiction book instead of a nonfiction book. No, it's not about that, but rather it's about trying to capture what it feels like rather than the dry facts.
I want to also just say, like, I really recommend this book because the experimental part, it kind of, I think in some ways, it does resist that, like, now you're going to learn Malaysian history. You think you are, maybe, but, it's like, it's a book on its own terms, Do you want to add anything, David, before we turn it over to the audience?
Don't look at let them speak.
So maybe
Say one
Thank
thing
you
for-
so much.
It's just amazing to hear when we as translators get together and talk about the things we work on, that then when you turn to a question answer portion, people always want to ask about loss. And like to think about like what actually is happening in translation is we're like making all these things possible. And like you said, like if we only had English language literature, what a horror show that would be for all of us, and how claustrophobic. And so like even just hearing you talk, it's like, wow, what a gain. Everything is just such a gain. And
Yeah. I think so.
I want to add actually we are going to turn it over, but one thing I want to just add to that, because I think translators are the best. I think part of it is because you're already from the beginning about something other than yourself. And I want to say one thing that translation has given me, even my original writing that I do, is to feel like it's a collaborative endeavor, that writing itself is collaborative. And there's something about, even when I'm just sitting down to write an essay or something of my own, it has opened up that field of writing for me. So I think in that spirit, there's something really wonderful about what opens up through that process. But we have time for a few questions, comments. Anyone has anything they want to ask?
So hard to see. Have some water.
I haven't thought this question through very well, but my general question, I think for all of you, especially in regards to politics, is where government funding comes in, because there's the obvious issue of when those governments themselves are inhumane or just right-wing, etc. But also I think you're all translating from languages that have, like, I don't know, like if you're translating from a Moroccan book, can you even expect to get funding from just a French organization, et cetera, et cetera? That's something that I think is where a lot of the money ends up coming from, but it can also have very problematic sort of ideological stuff tied into it. So I'm curious what your experiences have been.
I think I've gotten a couple of New York State grants. That's all and I feel comfortable getting money from New York State, generally speaking. I don't think I've gotten money from anyone else, any state organization other than New York State.
No, I didn't even think to reply. Not to go back to what I was saying, but it just feels like, Malha literature is such a minor literature that chances of securing funding from at like a state level seems pretty low. But I'm sure it's different for every translator.
I've received a lot of funding from the French government, and like the publishers specifically I've worked with have gotten grants from the French books or whatever it's called now. It's changing, and like that sort of goes into what I was saying earlier, that even when I'm translating a Moroccan writer or a Lebanese writer, funding becomes more possible if they've been published in France as opposed to in Morocco or in Lebanon, and that's tough. But there are, like, now there's more, there's Penn, there's the NEAs, there's other, like New York State. I didn't even know you could get, grants from New York State for translation. Who knew? Apparently everyone. But, it's, those things hopefully
Well-kept secret.
are like equalizers in some sense.
But they're also almost every country now offers translation grants. Like Georgia, for example, has a slew of money for translators who want to translate from the Georgian. Swedish, Finnish, any language you can think of is a good source. And
it's kind of like, I would say it's kind of this is not, I have not thought this through, but it's kind of like the Olympics, where like every state will maybe fund writing, but some states have more funding than others. Like there's a reason why some countries win a certain amount of medals, right? Like it's not a neutral kind of thing. But I think that there are, I have not received any funding. I have not applied for any. Well, I have not received. Let's say I have not received any funding, state funding or otherwise, for my work. I do want to say, just throw out one little thing that's just like, just to say it, because I just was learning about this a few weeks ago. One of the biggest funders for a long time of translation is the CIA.
Wow.
So it's part of the Cold War legacy. There's a committee, the Congressional Committee for Freedom. It really rocked. I mean, I knew, for instance, that the CIA funded the Paris Review and the Iowa Writers Program and things like that. But I did not know the degree to which internationally, like in Beirut, in India, in Africa, like Transition magazine was funded by the CIA. Forget the magazine in Beirut, but they published Talib Salih's Seasons of Migration to the North. Garcia Marquez is published is through funding from the CIA. So all your post-colonial faves are like funded by the CIA, and it's kind of, I mean, yeah. And so what do you do with that? I mean, it's not. I don't want to there's no direct. It's a complicated thing. What do you make of that then, I guess?
I think Garcia Marquez would be very angry to hear that he was funded by the CIA. He was funded by the CIAR, which is the Center for Inter-American Relations,
the translation,
which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. But you're absolutely right. Joel Whitney, do you know Joel?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's written a lot of articles about the influence of the CIA on not just translation, but writing in general, in which writers were, as you mentioned, the Paris Review, were being, supported by a very suspicious organization.
That's some politics for you. Any other questions?
Hi there.
Hi. You're also hard to. We have these lights that are sort of like blinding us. So.
Trying to find a spotlight. I was wondering, David, if you could speak a little bit to how you came to El Señor Presidente and the decision to retranslate that. I mean, you guys have all spoken so eloquently about the personal and the political dimensions. I was wondering how that came to you.
Well, as Melanie mentioned, I received this prize called the Miguel Ángel Asturias National Literature Prize for my fiction work primarily. And I was very honored to get that award, even though I don't live in Guatemala and I don't write in Spanish. So when I got the award, I was sort of wondering, what I could give back in a more real sense. I've translated 3 children's books by Rigoberta Menchú, and I translated the Popol Vuh. But there was this novel by Guatemala's only Nobel Prize-winning author that sort of was published first. The translation was done by a Brit, and not a very effective translation. And it was published in 1962. And in the early 60s was really the birth of the Latin American boom. And so writers like Vargas Llosa and Garcia Marquez, they were the young studs, and they were sort of like beginning to make their mark in the world. And this book came out in 1962, and the book had been written in the 20s and 30s by a writer who had been friends with Gertrude Stein and Bertolt Brecht and James Joyce. It was the first novel that really had elements of surrealism and Dadaism and dream language. But it just was published at the wrong time in the United States, and the novel just sort of like disappeared. Probably none of you have ever read Mr. President in its previous incarnation. And I had read it when I was like 18 or 19 and was amazed by it. And then rereading it in around 2016, 2017, I realized, wow, this is just an amazing novel. And in fact, I felt when I was rereading it that it was the most important Latin American novel of the 20th century. It's flawed in parts, and it's a difficult read because there are no redeeming characters in the novel, but it's an amazing novel. It's a failed love story, but it's a love story. And, I was very nervous doing my translation because I tried to make my translation amigable, friendly. And I think the previous translation was an unfriendly translation. It wasn't the kind of translation that sort of welcomed you into the book. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to see if I could translate this book and give it a fresh start in 2020, 2022. And because it's a dictator novel, it's very easier for critics like Claire Massoud got it perfectly when she reviewed it in Harper's, that this is could be a portrait of Bolsonaro, who thankfully lost, Trump, definitely Putin, but any one of the male despots that are sort of ruining this planet. And so the book came out in July, and a month later it went into a second printing. And I think it's because the time was right. I could take some credit as a translator, but it's just, it came out at the right time. That's a long answer. Sorry.
We have time for one more question.
Buy the books. That's all
Buy
I
the
can say.
books.
Buy the books.
So I am a new translator, but I'm a writer, and right now I'm teaching freshmen at Queens College, English 110, and we actually read one of your essays, YZ, How I Learned to Claim Space as a Multilingual Author, and a lot of them loved it and wrote essays about it and their relationship to language. But one thing I'm really trying to stress, and I think a lot of teachers teaching in the CUNY system here, is how younger writers or people who don't even see themselves as writers yet can really use their own multilingualism as a strength. So maybe translation, not a lucrative career, but I really was wondering if there was any words of wisdom you would maybe want to share with younger people on their beginning of their writing and translation journey of how to view their own multilingualism as a strength, especially coming up against, I think, the academy and these ideas of how you're supposed to sound as a writer. So, yeah, that's my question, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. That's so nice to hear. That's very kind of you. Thank you. And I don't know if this will come off the wrong way, but I feel like in some younger people, there might be a tendency to sort of view their multilingual backgrounds as divorce, 3 days with mom, 4 days with dad, the kind of thing. They feel split and torn, I definitely relate. I understand. I feel like where I find strength is I sort of, tell people I don't have a first language, I don't have a mother tongue, just because I'm just a product of multiple languages, many tongues, and I'm part of a translators collective called The Seams, and part of the meaning behind that is sometimes translations can be praised for being seamless, but that's not what we're going for. We are the seams, and the seams are important and beautiful and meaningful. Being multilingual is not about jumping across a river on like different, different stones trying not to fall. It's not the floor, it's lava. I think what's powerful for me about being multilingual is it simultaneously expands your thinking, like your consciousness. There are many ways you can think about the same thing, approach the same issue, but also it sort of lay bares the like artifice behind any language, behind any of your sayings or idioms or like blessings and curses. Like you sort of know, you are more aware that these are all human constructs, that they're passed down and they have survived and thrived for whatever reasons, and you make with that knowledge what you will. And I guess I would maybe encourage people who feel sort of lost or hampered or broken by being multilingual to think of it in that more expansive way, in that more clear-eyed way. I don't know if that makes sense.
I also want to add one thing to that, which is like maybe not the multilingual, but for the folks who feel like fractured, like you have partial access to a language that might be spoken at home, but you don't feel like you fully have it. Like I think some of us are teachers, and I feel like as a teacher, I really encourage students. Like I think everyone, there's one thing to be like, okay, we're going to pitch a translation and publish a translation, but I think in terms of like what translation can do, I think that I try to encourage anyone and everyone to do it, and I think it's like just start from where you're at, like because we all have more than we think that we do, and just a really quick thought about that is there's some theorists I think who've done some really interesting work on like from a post-colonial perspective, and like if you're thinking about indigenous folks, for instance, or post-colonial situations where language has been fractured because of historical violence, right? And so then in terms of disability studies, there's this whole discourse about then you're already, like the people who have partial access to the language are rendered like disabled in relationship to their own like language and culture. And so part of like there's been this conversation about actually like utilizing that and saying, well, like from a disability lens, for instance, or a post-colonial lens, to say, well, what if we just like start with what we've got? And what kind of creative kind of work can we produce from that standpoint, as opposed to a more traditional idea of like, you must completely master like all the languages in order to begin. So maybe we'll leave it there. So thank you everyone for coming out, and I think we've got some books on sale.
There are books in the bookstore. Thank you all. And yeah, come hang out with us. Go out there and we'll meet you out there. Okay, thanks everybody for coming.